In this video, we're going to begin developing the RSS Reader application that I've been alluding to for many of the videos in the series. This is going to help us put into practice all the things that we've learned over the past 11 videos and visualize how all the pieces of an entire application come together in order to create a real working application. So I want to emphasize that the purpose of the next 5 or 6 videos is to demonstrate how to build an application from start to finish, from concept to deploying it on somebody else's computer. And I want to start off by talking about the process that we're going to use to develop the application. And then starting in the next video, we're going to begin developing the application itself. And I'm going to be taking snapshots of the development process each hour or two in order to demonstrate how things are coming along. Because this application is probably going to take several hours to build, and most of that process is going to be just boring. So instead, I'm just going to hit the highlights, much like watching the evening news in order to review the highlights of tonight's baseball, football, soccer game, whatever the case might be. So at each point during the development, you're going to be able to download the source code and look through it as I explain what I've done over the course of an hour or two span of time that elapsed between each snapshot. Okay, so let's talk about the process that we're going to use to develop the application. There are many different formal software development processes that are available today, and most of them are designed for multiple developers working together within a corporate setting. One popular process was created for this purpose is called the Microsoft Solution Framework, and it outlines the steps that are required to build an application with multiple team members within a corporate environment. And ultimately, the Microsoft Solution Framework, or sometimes called MSF for short, boils down to some pretty basic steps. First, you envision what you want to build. Then next, you start planning how you're going to build it. And then third, you're going to start developing the application according to your plan. So that much seems pretty obvious common sense, and it's a great approach that we're going to take in developing our little application. Then after we've gone through the development process, then we want to start testing and eradicating any bugs in our application, and then finally we'll work on deploying the application. Now in the MSF, these 5 steps are repeated several times for a given software development project. So each time you repeat these series of steps, that's called an iteration. So think of our work together in the next 5 or 6 videos as the first iteration, and perhaps at the end of the series you'll take on additional iterations yourself, each time expanding the functionality of the application, making it more stable, improving it based on input from your friends and other users. Now again, we don't want to follow the MSF very closely. There's a lot of steps that we're simply not going to follow. We're not going to create a lot of the documentation that's meant to explain how things are going to work to our upper management and things of that nature. We don't really need formal requirement documents and so forth. We're just really doing this recreationally, and we're not going to worry about all that structure. Just keep in mind that someday, if you ever work for a company that uses a process like the MSF, it's not going to be just as easy as imagining some cool software project and then starting to develop some code. Typically, weeks or months of envisioning and planning happen before even the first line of code is written. But again, since it's just us creating a fun little application, we're not going to worry about all that. Still, we want to be somewhat structured so that we have a clear idea of what it is we're going to be building and how we're going to go about building it. So let's start with envisioning the solution. We want to build an RSS reader. Now, what exactly is RSS? Well, it stands for Really Simple Syndication, and it's used to syndicate articles or postings on a website or on a blog so that other websites or client software can determine which new items were recently added to a website. So, for example, let's take a look at the MSN homepage. So we've navigated to msdn.microsoft.com. This is the homepage for MSDN, the Microsoft Developers Network. And it has articles and resources that are aimed at developers. There's a lot of great content posted on MSDN very frequently, and rather than having to remember each day to visit this website, as well as maybe 24 other websites that are on your list of favorites, you could just subscribe to this website's RSS feed. So let's click on this little orange RSS button and take a look at what an RSS feed looks like. Notice that the RSS feed is nicely formatted due to the use of a cascading style sheet, but what it really looks behind the scenes is a little more XML-like. Let's go ahead and select View Source, and this is the actual XML feed, or the XML behind the RSS feed. Now, if you're not familiar with XML, this might look a little intimidating, but there's really a simple way to decipher it. It looks like a series of open tags and closing tags. So for example, here we have an open channel, it's our root node, and a closing channel at the very bottom. Inside the channels, you can see there are a series of items. So you have a begin item and an end item. Within each item, there's a title. So here's the begin title and the end title, and then the title of the actual article is in between those two tags. Same thing for description, link, and so on. Each combination of an open and a closed tag is called an element, and elements can contain data or they can contain other elements to create sort of a parent-child hierarchy. So now let's take a look at another website that I've already navigated to, and this is the RSS specification. And as we browse through the specification, we can see that there are several required elements within the channel tag. So we have a title, a link, and a description that are all required. And then there are a number of optional channel elements as well: language, copyright, managing editor, webmaster, and so on. There's actually quite a few that are listed here, as well as some notes on how RSS should be utilized within applications that are both producing RSS feeds and consuming RSS feeds. Our application will consume RSS feeds. So for our purposes, what we're going to do is simply focus on only those elements that are required. So we're only going to pay attention to title, link, and description. So in the case of the MSDN RSS feed, we would only be paying attention to the title, the description, and the link, and we'll be ignoring the rest. Now at some point in time, you can come back and expand this application so that it can look for all the non-required elements as well. So back to our process, we are currently envisioning the solution, and envisioning the solution involves having a vision. So it's something maybe like this, that I'd like to build an application that does XYZ. Now at this point, we're really not designing an application, we're just making some mental notes about things that we'd like to see in an application. Now the vision that I have for this application is to create an RSS reader that allows users to consume and read through the news items that are collected from RSS feeds. Each RSS feed can be called simply a channel, and you can think of channels on your television set. These are sources for information. Now there are already several good RSS readers available both commercially and as freeware. However, just for fun, we're going to build one that's really simple, and then we can customize it any way we want to. So I'm going to take some notes, maybe on a whiteboard, about what I think this application should allow a user to do. First, I want to allow a user to subscribe to a channel. In other words, to input a URL for our RSS.xml file, or whatever the case might be. And then we want to be able to allow the user to organize the channels into a folder so that all of our RSS feeds or channels that have something to do with world news can be put in one folder, or all of them that have to do with technology can be in another folder, and just a way of organizing all of our channels, because we could potentially have hundreds of different channels. Then I want to allow the user to view individual news items that are collected from each channel in a web browser. And then I want to be able to refresh the channels in order to get the latest news items. And for our first pass, I think what we're simply going to do is make that a manual process. But in the future, we could create this in such a way that it just goes out and checks once an hour or every so often in order to pull down the latest news. Now I also need to allow my user to edit and delete channels, and edit and delete folders as well, so that they can manage which sources that they want to pull data from. And then finally, we want to provide any feedback, like whether the application is working or if it's encountered a problem, in a very unobtrusive sort of way. So these are some of the design goals that I have and some of the features that I want to implement within this application. So we have a basic vision of what we want to build. We're going to need to nail down some of the specifics for the application. So we're moving from the envisioning phase, where we're imagining what would be cool to build, and we're moving more into a planning phase. Now, planning involves several things. We're going to need to think about our application from several different perspectives. Each perspective is like the facet of a diamond. They'll allow us to focus on a different aspect of the entire solution. An application's logical design allows us to think about how the software pieces are going to all fit together. Now, in our case, it's a pretty simple and straightforward design. We're going to have a single executable application that accesses the internet and then grabs information from the internet and stores it into a SQL Server 2005 Express Edition database. An application's physical design allows us to think about where the software will reside. Again, in our case, that's pretty simple. This is going to be a pure client application, but in larger applications that are built for use within companies, we may want to divide the software application into several parts, each part hosted on a separate computer, in order to distribute the processing load that each computer is responsible for, and this will allow us to speed up the application in high load scenarios. So this is particularly true of higher end websites that have to support hundreds of concurrent users. In this case, we may have to map what software elements reside on which computers. Again, in our case, that's not so. We're building a fairly simple application. We also have to think in terms of the user interface, and the user interface deals with the interaction between the human and the software. And there's many best practices and ideas that people have about how to make software more usable, and most of them are, quite honestly, common sense. Ideally, the user is going to be able to sit down and start using the software with very little instruction. Now, that's not always possible, and there are several visual cues that we can build into the application that make it more usable, so we should strive to do that. Now, as we're going through the design of the user interface in particular, one approach that we can take in order to get our ideas down and have others provide some feedback on them is through the use of what's called a low-tech mock-up. In other words, we just want to draw some ideas about how our form is going to be laid out on a sheet of paper and perhaps show them to a few friends. Nothing fancy. I want to get some feedback and literally go back to the drawing board and refine some of the original ideas based on the feedback I get from some friends. This is a lot like the way that larger organizations do it, except that they spend a lot of money and time conducting usability studies. And this is a luxury that we simply can't afford since we're just really building this for fun. And then finally, we need to design the data, or in other words, we need to decide on what data elements we're going to need to save to the database, what to call them, what relationships should exist between the data, and so on. So let's take a moment to go to our whiteboard again and hash out some design ideas. Before I do that, one last note about planning. In a company setting, planning also involves delegation of tasks and responsibilities, creating a timeline for each task with dependencies, acquiring resources, so finding people to work on your project, getting the software in place, the hardware, and so on. However, we're not going to really discuss these at length because they really don't apply to our recreational coding project that we're undertaking. In the real world, these sorts of exercises can be very important, if not crucial, to the success of our project. Okay, so now on to designing the UI and the structure of the database. And sometimes I do this at the same time. I flesh out ideas about the UI and the database even when I'm just doing some recreational coding, and I usually keep 2 sheets of paper. I think about what elements of information I want to display on screen, and then what are the underlying data structures in our database that will have to be created in order to support that UI. Now, in the case of our RSS Reader application, this becomes pretty simple because we do have a specification to follow, and we're going to keep it fairly simple. So we know, for example, that we want to have the concept of a folder that will contain channels. So I might draw these down on the sheet of paper. I might show that there's this concept of a folder, and a folder would have, for example, a folder ID and a folder name. The ID would simply just be a primary key. And then what I would want to do is create a channel table, and we know that channels will have a name, which we're going to call title, and there's going to be a URL associated with it. This will be the place, the location on the internet where we're going to grab down this RSS feed, this XML feed. We also may want to keep track of when it was last updated, and then we need to create a foreign key relationship between a channel and a folder, because folders will contain channels. So each channel needs to know who its parent is, in this case, which folder will contain that channel. Now each individual channel is going to contain a series of items, which I'm calling news items. And so each news item, as we have seen from the RSS specification, will have a title. So the article will have a title. It'll have a short description. It'll also have potentially a link associated with it. And I'm going to want to also keep track of the date that we acquired it. And so we'll store that in the database as well. Finally, we'll need a foreign key relationship between the channel and the news item, so I'll create a channel ID foreign key relationship. Now from the UI perspective, what I'm probably going to do is download some applications that already exist and take a look at what a common way is to represent those on screen. Now from a little bit of work that I've done in this area, I know that there's usually a Windows Explorer type view where you have your feeds on the left hand side organized in a tree view, and on the right hand side you'll have some type of like a Internet Explorer view of those individual news items. Now for our purposes we're going to take a slightly different approach because we maybe haven't advanced quite enough to build that style of application, but we'll use a similar metaphor. So we'll have a list box that'll contain all of our folders, and by selecting one of the folders we'll see a list of channels that are in that folder. And then by selecting one of the channels, we'll see all of the news items that are associated with that given channel that have been pulled down from the RSS feed. By selecting an individual news item, then we'll see all the details, the title, the description, the link, and we'll even allow our user to click on a link and then view that within a little Internet Explorer window, a little web window within the same form. Now later on I can come back and update the UI and try more of a tree view style interface, but for right now I just want to keep it real simple and get the core application working before I worry about more UI enhancements. So now at this point I might take my design and run it past a few of my friends who are also software developers. I might take the UI and put it in front of some people who are not software developers, who are just maybe target users, and get their feedback. A lot of their feedback will be things that I don't want to implement necessarily for this first iteration, but things that I might think about as nice to haves in future versions of my application. So we want to keep our application scoped fairly small so that we actually finish the project and we don't become susceptible to something called scope creep, which is the tendency for developers to want to add in a lot of features into the application, and which makes the application get larger and larger, and it takes more time to complete. We want a quick win, a quick success before we begin to add in too many features. So we're going to try and keep our scope fairly small, but take our users' input and try to refine our design. And then once we get a design that we're pretty happy with for version 1, we're going to start the development process. So now I'm going to open up my development tool, create a new project, and start to flesh out my first snapshot, my first iteration. And so that will be where we'll pick up in the next video.